Right, chapter 20 is essentially Europe from 1814 to 1847. This is a chapter that deals with the aftermath of Napoleon, but also is going to lead us towards what's going to happen in 1848, which is a massive wave of revolution again. The chapter begins with the Congress of Vienna, where the powers that had defeated Napoleon will get together and decide to remake Europe in the years after Napoleon's defeat. Called in 1814, it's essentially designed to try to restore the balance of power. The leader there was Tsar Alexander I, who wanted to expand Russian influence. The most important figure maybe at the whole meeting was Clemens von Metternich, who is the foreign minister of Austria. They all get together, and essentially what they do is redraw the map of Europe. So after the Congress of Vienna, France shrinks back to the way it had been prior to the revolution. Essentially, what they want to do is grind the gears of time back to the way things had been in Europe prior to the French Revolution. They kind of want to forget about those years from 1789 until 1815 when France almost conquered all of Europe. To preserve it, what they want to do is create essentially an alliance. The great powers of Prussia, Austria, Russia, Great Britain, and later France decided to create an alliance that would stomp out any chance of further revolution. And if any further revolution happened, they would all ally together to make sure that it didn't get any traction. The Metternich, like I told you, is the real guiding sort of influence. But one of the major sort of ideas of the Congress of Vienna, and Metternich is a great example of this ideology, is conservatism. Conservatism is one of those things that if you have power, you're essentially a conservative because you don't want things to change. These powers, especially the absolute powers in Europe, had seen way too much change as a result of the French Revolution. And that's why they want to grind the clock back to the way things had been before the French Revolution. The Congress of Vienna sets all these standards. We don't want any more change. We're going to turn the map of Europe back to the way it had been, and we don't want anything else to change. But it's all been set into motion. It's easy to say that. It's going to be a whole lot more difficult to deal with after the French Revolution. The uh, the other sort of thing is that there are threats that are already lining up. One, you're going to start. Sometimes this period of time is called the age of the ism or the period of the isms. And you start hearing, you're going to hear me talk about today things like conservatism, liberalism, nationalism, romanticism. Okay. And so there are things that are just simply going to happen that are real threats to the system. Even though they want to keep it the way things are, there are certain things that are going to happen. For example, you'll read about the Greek crisis, where the Greeks are going to rise up in rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks are Christians. You have a Christian country that's rising up in rebellion against a Muslim one. So if you're the powers of Europe, you say, well, we don't want any more change. But here's an example of the Greeks wanting their independence from a Muslim nation. The British press and the British people demand that the British help the Greeks. So they say they don't want any more change, but change is going to happen. Romanticism is also a big deal. If you have taken an art appreciation class or a literature class, you deal with romanticism. All right. And you guys can read about romanticism on your own. But essentially, romanticism is anti rational. It's all about emotion, it's all about passion. It embraces really new forms of expression and beauty. Romantics aren't big fans of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was all about the neoclassical, it was all about order and structure. Romantics are not into that. And so romantics are essentially people who want change. They are emotion, nature is all about change. And so for them, the natural world is one of change. So you see, even in art, this philosophy of life that deals with creativeness and deals with this idea of emotion. And you're going to see it in nationalism, for example. Now, the conservatism is one of those isms I told you about already. Change is a bad thing. Much of Europe, it would much, especially much of the upper classes of Europe, would fit into this conservatism mold. They don't like change. They don't like the idea that things are going to or could change. That's why they didn't like revolution. They're already in charge. They don't want that to change. And so the text talks about several of these. Now, the most conservative of these is probably Russia under Tsar Nicholas I. So, returning back to Russia's Orthodox religious values, and you can go and read about that. Maybe even turning back the clock on Peter the Great's reforms. Liberalism is the next in line, and liberalism, of course, embraces the Enlightenment and embraces change. So it's the kind of polar opposite of conservatism. The liberalism emphasizes individual liberty, justice, civil rights, private property, optimistic about human nature, just like the Enlightenment thinkers were. Now, 19th century liberals, though, don't like government interference, especially in the economy. And so most don't believe that women were equal to men. Most don't believe that the government should intervene. And so therefore things like we are used to today, like minimum wage laws or safety laws in the industrial workplace, they would be opposed to that because that is government interference. The one of the biggest ones that you need to really get a hold on in this chapter is nationalism. Okay, nationalism is not patriotism. Okay, nationalism is something totally different. Nationalism before 1848 is about, it's a mixture really of liberalism, democracy. Now, then it will kind of shift and become more conservative. But nation and state are what you need to understand. Okay, a state is a political entity. Okay, a nation is a group of people bound together by common language, culture, religion, history, or even ancestry. So, what if you are a group of people that all speak the same language, but you don't have a state that represents you? Best examples I can give you: Germany. Okay, there is no Germany in 1848 yet. So people that would identify themselves as German, people that speak German, for example, they don't have a state that represents them. Italy, same way. Okay. So, and you'll read about that. Nationalism is going to be one of the, it's like gasoline on the fire. It's going to make and start really affecting change in Europe. The You will see some change taking place despite what the Congress of Vienna talked about. You will see them, for example, you will talk about the revolutions of 1830 in France. Louis XVIII was a terrible monarch, and eventually is when he dies is replaced by Charles X in France, who rules from 1824 to 1830. And he is so conservative that the people of France get so tired of him, they boot him out and replace him with Louis Philippe, who rules France from 1830 to 1848, who promised that he was going to abide by a constitution, who was going to make some reforms. Now he doesn't, and which is why he gets booted out later in 1848. Make sure that you take a look at this section about nationalism. It is crucial that you understand nationalism because of what's going to happen later when we talk about the unification of Germany and the unification of Italy. If you understand German nationalism now, if you understand Italian nationalism now, when you read about Mazzini, when you read about Garibaldi, those guys, they're going to play a role later on when we unify Italy later on. Okay, Italian unification movements and nationalism are beginning. The German unification is going to sort of probably get its start in about 1848 or so. So think about that. Okay. And as you read about this, we're going to draw parallels to this later on. The chapter finishes really. Oh, and by the way, it does go on to talk a little bit about the Greek War for Independence. So make sure you kind of take a look at that. The last part of the, the chapter deals with what happens in England. There's an old saying among historians that while Europe revolts, England reforms. And so rather than have reform, or rather than have revolts in 1830 and 1848 like the rest of Europe will, the English actually managed to go through a period of reform during this period. So make sure that you take a look at the move towards reform. Okay, the biggest thing you need to kind of take away from this chapter about the about England is the Reform Bill of 1832. So the Reform Bill increases the number of voters by 50%. Now, that means that only about somewhere around 20% of the population of England can now vote, which tells you how much reform really was needed. The parliamentary representation is redistributed to help some of these newly populated, especially industrial areas. So the slave trade is outlawed in 1807. The Corn Laws are eventually repealed, and eventually later you get into the Factory Acts, and you'll read about the Factory Acts of 1833, 1842, 1847. The first time really you see a government start to put in some I guess regulations on factories, especially dealing with children and women. So make sure that you kind of take a look at this as you go through this chapter.